Okay, so if you've just tuned in, we are talking about parental alienation syndrome today, parental alienation. So sort of a broad term, which has been used and highly misunderstood as well in society. We're really chatting about it today to just sort of raise awareness for Parental Alienation Awareness Day, which is 25th of April. So we're going to be talking a little bit about parental alienation, what it is, sort of how it manifests, what the implications are, and the impact that it has on perhaps a psychological, emotional, and behavioural level. So I've got with me Barry Viljoen.
Hi, Jon. Thanks for having me.
Which is a former colleague of mine. Barry's a clinical psychologist, and I myself am a clinical psychologist in private practice. And just some of my research, which I did in my dissertation, was about unmarried fathers' experiences in parental alienation, and just to sort of get a take on the father's view, although it's a phenomenon that affects both child and parent and all the parties involved, as well as extended family. So maybe let's just talk about what is parental alienation?
Yeah, so Jon, I think you've already touched on something there that I think is very important, is the fact that maybe a lot of the confusion comes is the fact that a lot of old research purely looks at the fathers and has neglected children and maybe neglected the fact that, it could be another partner. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the history of it. So it comes from 1985, more or less, was Gardner coined the term. And maybe we also have to understand that historically, that in context, legally as well at that point, mothers specifically would have automatic custody of children. So if anyone was going to be excluded, it was more likely going to be a father than a mom. Obviously, things have changed a little bit now.
So as you mentioned about Gardner, which sort of a term that was coined by him, as I understand, and through the research, he started observing these symptoms that occurred within child custody disputes. So there was a cluster of symptoms, which also puts us in a position of really talking about whether it's a syndrome or not.
Yeah, that's another very actual valid point that people have made. So already, if you listen to this and you're Googling it, you're not going to find in the DSM or the ICD-10. You can find aspects that overlap, but it's very much a syndrome at this point officially. So more research needs to go into it, which is one of the first things that people would say is the argument. And I think there needs to be more clarification as to exactly what symptoms we're seeing, because I think, like you highlighted, there's a cluster of symptoms or behaviors, and I think that's maybe where it gets a little bit messy in terms of the construct. So I think maybe that's where we need more research as well. And also, how do we identify it? I mean, maybe that's the other thing to take into account. So normally when we're giving a diagnosis, it's of a specific individual who meets certain criteria. But now we're looking at already a bit of an emotional minefield, because you've got mom and dad who either have separated or never had a relationship that's no longer. So there's a lot of emotions that are going on, and now there's a child that's resulted from that relationship. And now both are trying to have some level of custody and involvement. So maybe that's also where it becomes very difficult. I think criticism often, I don't know if you've read the same thing, the psychologist will be hired by one parent, and then the other parent will say, oh, but they're against me. That's why they're seeing this or not seeing this. I don't know if that's been your experience.
So I suppose not take into account that this is a family system issue. I mean, if we're talking about a syndrome and we're talking about this cluster of symptoms, really saying that, there's obviously parties involved. We're looking at the father, we're looking at the mother, we're looking at the child, sort of in a triangulation. And I suppose the alienator bears symptoms as well as the alienated and as well as the child. And I suppose these symptoms are not always clear because they're coming from the three different parties.
Sure. And again, I mean, even if you interview the child, you don't want a child to take sides, but that's already what's playing out, right?
The implication of it. As I understand, I think in the what clinicians are using these days and legal systems and things is the parent-child relational problem in the DSM, but there isn't a category for parental alienation yet. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the new ICD-11, I think is going to have it in there.
It's definitely one of the debates that are happening, for sure.
As more research has been accumulated and things like that. So we're looking at, basically what parental alienation is, and just sort of in a nutshell, is that it's really just the primary manifestation of a campaign of denigration coming from the child who sides with one parent against another parent. So we're looking at these coalitions here that operate on a conscious and unconscious level. So it really is just a systemic issue if we look at it that way.
And I think already the fact you've highlighted that it's conscious and unconscious is a lot of the time people say, oh, but just ask the child. Does the one parent turn you against the other parent? And like you said, it's hard to know that, especially for a child especially if we're thinking about a younger child. It's not that clear cut of, oh, but mom or dad have said 1, 2, 3 about my other parent. So I think that also makes it quite complicated. That often children who are going through parental alienation aren't aware of it until much later, which again I think is some of the reflections in literature, is that parents or children later reflect and they go, oh, okay, that's what was going on.
I think Amy Baker touched on that quite a bit, where she interviewed sort of adults or children that were adults and that went through it, and that now they're sort of having all these manifestations of symptoms and things like that that has to do with identity and things like that. I think it's important to note as well, because at the same time it's underrepresented.
Sure.
It's under researched, especially in a South African context. But at the same time, it's a term that's become loosely used in society, and I think it's important to note that parental alienation is something that occurs in the context of unfounded allegations. So I think that's quite important.
So in that, what you're saying, Jon, is the fact that if there is some level of abuse or if there is some level of neglect, then it can't be parental alienation. Okay.
So I think it's looking at this when we talk about sort of what Richard Gardner mentioned about the child custody disputes. So it's there was never sort of parental alienation before that, but now because this sort of incident arises where they find themselves in a child custody dispute, and all of a sudden one parent is sort of using the child as a tool against the other parent. So I think if we say it loosely like that, using the child as a tool, which it is, we're sort of looking at how the main thing that's involved here is sort of the sense of power and control. So it's sort of using the child in order to have control over the other parent to sort of make requests financially.
Sure. It's almost like a bargaining tool is what you're saying.
Sure.
And I think that's very interesting that you say that, because if you go and you look at South African literature, and I use that example, and if we look at the law, especially in custody suits or disputes, there isn't ever the term, or there isn't any literature highlighting parental alienation. That isn't used by attorneys. But you've highlighted the fact about blocking of access to the child. You've also talked about using the child as a bargaining tool. And I think there's another term that's been used where they talk about, malicious use of a child in those custodies.
So I suppose that would also fall under the severity of parental alienation, the different levels, the sort of the mild, the moderate, severe levels.
How would you define that?
So look, I mean, in the child custody dispute, we're looking at the mild, moderate, and severe, as I mentioned. So on the level of severity of severe, we're looking at no contact at all with the child. So I've heard of instances where sort of, we're saying fathers in this instance, as seen in the majority of cases, not to say that women are not being alienated as well.
Sure, and also maybe that's another thing that needs to be more research done on same-sex couples, for example.
Sure.
Where then you could have two people of the same gender being, either or being excluded.
So I suppose there's that sense in terms of severity, again, it all boils down to sort of what the intention is behind it. So you'll find in a lot of the mild cases, one partner is sort of holding a sense of resentment about the breakup or the split up or the divorce or whatever it may be. And, finds himself in a position of ambivalence and sort of as an attempt to cope, I would say, the alienator, which basically uses the child to sort of bargain for power, as you mentioned earlier.
So in that kind of case, we're thinking about, so look, obviously there's a large amount of alienators who have some other psychopathology. That's what Gardner and other literature was saying. So in this kind of case of these milder ones, it's someone who's upset about it and maybe has maladaptive coping mechanisms. Is that kind of what we're saying? So two people split up, the one is very, very hurt, and then would maybe badmouth or say bad things about the former partner to the child or in front of the child. Would that be an example of mild in your eyes?
So Benet sort of found a lot of research in terms of the severity, in terms of the mild, moderate. So I would agree with you that on the mild, it's simply motivated, like I said, the intention behind it, it's simply motivated by the sense of being acutely, if we can call it acute, symptoms where one is upset and sort of resentful and sort of has some animosity towards the breakup and things like that. But when we get to the mild level, we're looking at things where you're starting to see sort of personality disorders emerging.
Okay, so you think you're already seeing it right at that level?
Sure.
Okay.
So such as like underlying narcissism, things like that, covert narcissism. But on the severe level where we sort of looking at sort of casting the parent out completely with no contact, where I've heard of instances of mothers, say, for example, taking children overseas without permission.
Sure, okay.
Fathers that haven't had contact with their children in years. And we're looking at what Benet found is that there was a common thread between the severity of it in that most of these alienators, through psychometric testing and things that were done, evaluation, found a lot of narcissistic traits, borderline traits, things like that.
So a lot of your cluster B personalities.
Yes, a lot of cluster B personalities, which was, sort of, if we can say it in layman's terms, a sense of emotional instability.
Sure. Okay.
Which a lot of these alienators had at the time. So we spoke a little bit about that sense of attempt for power and control.
Sure.
So that really says something about something. If we think about power and control, we're thinking about the sense of authoritarianism in society.
From the alienator?
From the alienator, yes. So the alienated parent is really put in a position of being in a one-down position to that of the alienator. So the use of the child is being used to bargain more for a sense of, there may be physical means, let's just say like finance and things like that, but it goes deeper on a psychological and emotional level of sort of bargaining for power and control, which ultimately allows one to manipulate and to sort of
so what you're saying more or less is like, if you want to see your child, you see your child on my terms, and I need to be in your life still as well.
I think it's important to highlight that there's that authoritarian process that happens there, that sense of power over somebody, which in my research, basically what I try to show.
Yeah, maybe let's talk a little bit about your research. That is a fascinating topic.
Yeah, so I try to show really
in this country.
Yeah, so I really try to show sort of how it's, well, not sort of, but I try to. I found that some of the psychological, emotional, and behavioural manifestations were very much in line or mimicked symptoms of the oppressed mind. People that have gone through oppression.
Sure. So people who maybe been disempowered throughout their life.
Yes.
Okay.
Even if we're looking at issues which, just as an example, like apartheid, we're looking at World War II, things like that. That sense of one having power over another one. There's the sense of, there's something very interesting that happens around that when I say oppression. This person sort of feels oppressed by the other person, but what this means is that it really challenges one's identity and self-identity, because what we're doing is we're looking at the sense of, if I'm a father, for example, I can only be that of a father in relation to that of a child.
Sure. So if I don't have a child, or I don't have access to a child, what kind of father are you?
And where does that leave me? A child is only a child in relation to that of parents.
Okay.
So it really molds and shapes one's identity. And now there's the sense of this difficult sort of grieving process that comes along with that. The grieving process is through no one's choice at all.
Sure. But I mean, I'm wondering about wouldn't that just be a stagnated grieving process? Because you've almost lost this child, but the child still exists.
The child still exists.
So it's more that the relationship is still there, but you just don't have access to it.
And the thing is, what happens is that because of that factor you're mentioning about the child still existing, this definitely becomes complex grief.
For sure.
Complex bereavement, because you're mourning somebody that you know is well and out there, and yet your identity of that of being a father is still in relation or connected in somehow to that of the child.
Sure.
So it really puts one in an ambivalent position of questioning one's self-identity. If I don't have my child, but I do have my child at the same time, who am I really?
Yeah.
And one sort of finds themselves in this existential crisis where there's a lot of manifestations of that, such as we're looking at anxiety, depression, inability to sleep, so insomnia.
Sure.
And the thing is, the problem with it is that these fathers are presenting at psychologists and things like that and being misdiagnosed, being diagnosed as having depression, but not really getting to the root of how this has come about.
So those maintaining factors. So they probably do have depression. I think we can maybe agree on that in certain cases. But it's about what's maintaining it, which is the social situation.
Sure.
And I'm also wondering, you're talking about grieving patterns, right? And we talk about generally, again, it's a huge generalization, but how men and women grieve differently. Often emotional grieving is far more associated with women, whereas men will grieve with if you lose your child, maybe something like starting up a foundation named after the child, right? So, I mean, there's almost a mobilization. But in this case, the child isn't gone. So they're kind of stuck in that whole pattern of grief, and they can't move to maybe processes which would help them move through this grief.
And I'm glad you highlighted that, because if we're looking at, in society, there's sort of coming from this misperception of masculinity in society, in that fathers, boys don't cry.
Well, that's a whole nother story,
which is the well-known one. And then sort of fathers find themselves in this position of mourning all the time for their child,
and longing for something that they've never really had, or maybe they had, but it's not done. And in the same light, I think we see far too frequently these kind of comments of like deadbeat dads, and then you very much get lumped into that if you don't.
And I suppose there's been, I've read a ton of research and instances where, sort of the father is now not allowed to be involved in the child's life. But when the father does want to be involved in the child's life, so for example, going to the child's school, things like that, and then he's sort of termed as a stalker. So it's sort of, if I'm involved in the child's life, I'm a stalker and I'm overbearing, and if I'm not involved in the child's life, I'm a deadbeat dad, as you're saying.
So it's kind of a juxtaposition. You're almost stuck in this continuous double bind.
Correct. Continuous double bind all the time, and in terms of from a psychological and emotional perspective as well, this double bind, like I mentioned earlier, this ambivalence of who am I if I'm not a father, but yet at the same time I am a father as well. It's sort of if I jump, I'm wrong. If I don't jump, I'm still wrong.
And I mean, I'm wondering, do you think, like with a lot of dads, or well, it's called dads, fathers, who are experiencing this, do you think there's a decline in their general functioning in terms of their work life, their social life? Do you think that happens?
So look, I mean, when I think about my research and some of the participants that I interviewed for my research, which was a qualitative study, sort of just to get a deeper sense of the experience, I remember going to a father's place to sort of interview him, and I mean, there was no furniture in the whole house. He was completely financially strained. Not being able to, having to take off days of work to sort of go to court and things like that.
Because obviously it's a lengthy process where, I mean, the wheels of justice move fairly slowly. We know that.
Sure. That's why, we're talking about parental alienation today as a family systemic issue. But I would go to the broader system even and say it's really just a social issue, and hence there's no awareness on it or psychoeducation, because what's happening is that, this is happening. There's the alienator has their reasons, however unfounded those reasons may be, and vice versa.
Or how poorly understood they are, because I think you've also said it's an unconscious process a lot of the time.
And so what's happening is we're finding that, yes, the incident is happening, these occurrences are happening, but what is perpetuating them? And if we look at the legal system, the problem is that there are no repercussions for what's been going on. So mom does this, father takes mom to court, gets a court order, mom goes against the court order. Now, because mom is the primary resident and attachment, can't exactly have repercussions for that. Fathers find themselves having to go to court on an ongoing basis, which leaves them financially strained, having to miss work, losing their jobs, things like that.
So always having to use the court to negotiate, because there isn't the breakdown of that relationship between the two parents. That's a very valid point.
I would say I would go as far as saying that the biggest issue with parental alienation and why it keeps happening, the perpetuating factor is that there are no repercussions for what's being done for this sort of behavior of alienating a parent.
I also think, like you were saying, socially as well, I think we're in a bit of a state of flux where historically, and I think especially in this country, mothers are seen as carers. Right, fathers are kind of seen as providers, and if you're a good dad, it means you can financially provide. Emotional involvement is questionable; it's not always necessary. And now there's a shift that, emotional involvement is becoming so much more important from dads, and it's almost kind of one of these things that well, I think we could solve a lot of the problems in this country if we were to have greater parental involvement from both parents.
Absolutely. And I think, that sense of we spoke a little bit about, the impact, and we're speaking a bit now about the impact on the father and sort of the psychological, emotional, and behavioral impact that this has on the father, but also looking at the child and what sort of impact this has on the child as well, and in terms of the attachment, etc., with the father. It got me thinking about something interesting where,
because this is the part that's going to excite me far more, talking about the kids.
Sure. There's this, there's this interesting thing that happens, as I'm sure you know, Barry, and there's been tons of research on it. There's something very significant that happens between pre-verbal and verbal of a child's development, and you'll find a lot of times that sort of the pre-verbal memories and things like that are not declarative. They're non-declarative because there's no symbols, language,
sure,
to put to these memories and things like that. Okay. And what happens is that when they transition to the verbal, and I say transition, highlighting that word, it is a transitional phase, and they go to the verbal, now they've got sort of declarative memory where they can sort of attach symbols to this stuff. So normally what happens is you're finding that, early on breakups where the child is pre-verbal, chances are that the child is attached to the parent on a psychological, emotional, and behavioral level without language. So there's something deeper there.
For sure.
Unconscious level that's happening. And then once the child starts to declare it, these memories just become more prominent as well. So it's quite a complex process that takes place on the child.
For sure. I mean, maybe we can talk about, like you said, the child in terms of, infant mental health, in terms of child mental health, and maybe we can actually even speak about, prenatal mental health, because I think that's also a whole nother new, very exciting field that's got a lot of interest for me, is what is mom's health or mental state like at the time of pregnancy? What was the relationship like? And I think studies are showing already it makes a big difference whether it's a one-night stand, a committed relationship, an abusive relationship, a tumultuous relationship. Already at that stage, it's having all kinds of effects on how this child is going to be when they're born, even before they're born.
And I think we've seen that in the research when you talk about that as well, the sense of, let's say, mothers that are having kids on their own and things like that. It's played a big part in our social context in terms of children growing up without father figures.
Sure.
Has had a big impact on,
of course,
on the child's emotional well-being.
Well, I mean, it sets that whole kind of baseline of like, what do we expect in terms of romantic and supportive relationships? What do we need to bring as well to them? How should we behave? There's a whole modeling aspect that comes in there as well. And I think, also when you spoke about attachment, maybe we should just clarify exactly what attachment means. So attachment, obviously, coming from Bowlby's theories, where it was the relationship with the primary caregiver, predominantly, again, generally a mom, right? But it doesn't have to only be a mom. It can be multiple figures.
I think, actually, I want to interrupt you right there. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now is, from the psychoanalytic school, we're talking about attachment where it was termed with Bowlby, etc. And I think for a long time it was primarily assumed that attachment occurs between mother and child. But we're seeing these days that the attachment can very well be between father and child as well. So there's an equal level of attachment that's going on.
Well, I mean, even like you said in that, I mean, children who have multiple attachment figures actually often, will be healthier. So in settings where you don't necessarily have a parent, but you have lots of family members who are stepping up to the plate, you can actually negate a lot of psychopathology. Well, that's what studies are starting to show, as long as you have good enough and solid attachment. So again, what we're saying with that is that relationship sets the basis for developing like a blueprint, an internal working model of how all your future relationships are going to be. So I think already what you were saying, Jon, is we're talking about like that enmeshment. So the whole process generally of childhood is initially children don't see their mom as something or their caregiver as something separate to them rather than extension of themselves. And we know as we go along, we suddenly start realizing, oh, hey, this is me, that's mom, and there's a bit more of a differentiation. And we eventually get to that really messy stage of adolescence when we're like, oh, I hate everyone, I want to be by myself, I'm one of my own person. And eventually we get to a point where we have healthy dynamics in terms of, oh, this is me, this is my primary attachment figure, these are my other relationships, I don't need to be clinging to them, I'd also need to push them away. But if that initial relationship is so unhealthy, and you use the word enmeshment, so that's where differentiation doesn't happen. That's where, and again, I'm going to use mom as the example in this. If mom and the child are enmeshed in a coalition against dad, there's a lot of problems that are coming for that.
So
child.
we're looking at when you talk about the enmeshment, we're looking at how the mom sort of puts a child in a position of understanding that you're basically an extension of myself. So in other words, if I hate dad, you must hate dad as well. I wanted to go back to what you're talking about in terms of Bowlby's attachment, just as an example. You know, we're talking about there's, say, ambivalent attachment, there's that detached attachment, there's the sense of secure attachment. It's sort of, this goal of what happens when you spoke about the child being born and being connected to mom. There's the separation that has to take place for the child. But a child cannot separate without having that firm sense of secure attachment. And now the child finds themselves in an ambivalent position, and what you've got going on is that they develop this ambivalent sense of attachment. So they're constantly in a double bind for the rest of their lives. And I think Baker found that in a study with the adult children that spoke about parental alienation and how ambivalent they were. They had no sort of a fragile sense of self. They weren't 100% sure about who they were or how they viewed themselves, and especially in relation to that of the other. And a lot of relationships that they got into got very enmeshed and very sort of the sense of that I control you or you control me in some way.
And I'm so scared that you're going to leave me at any point and then my world will end, right? So, I mean, ultimately, like what you're saying with secure attachment, maybe just to define that for everyone, I mean, ultimately, it's that there's safety. The world is a safe place. My primary attachment figure is going to make sure that I'm okay and I can explore. And when I go away and I come back, they should be there. And that's ultimately what we should have. So then the person can develop a solid sense of self. They aren't not anxious with their engagements with the world. They have the ability to explore, but also the ability to come back and be like, I'm comfortable where I am. Whereas if we think about those other kind of maladaptive attachment styles, it's not as comfortable. It's always a state of emotional arousal, right? There's
always sort of that state of emotional crisis, if you will, which has potential to sort of manifest borderline personality disorder on some level as well.
I mean, that's one. I mean, a lot of your psychopathologies are linked to all the other attachment styles.
Sure. And the reason we say personality disorder for our viewers is that, personality disorder is something that's pervasive over time. So something that's already starting in perhaps pre-adolescence, childhood maybe, and that carries on later on in life. And
I'm glad you highlighted that, because I mean, you use the word narcissist, which I think in most social media we've all heard it about someone's ex at some point, right?
Definitely a term very used very broadly, broadly and widely and loosely. Yes. So, look, I mean, we've spoken a little bit about what parental alienation is. Perhaps I'm thinking we should maybe also just touch on sort of, how does this manifest? What are the strategies of parental alienation? For example, say, bad-mouthing, and how it actually operates on a conscious and unconscious level as well.
So can you give us an example, Jon, maybe of what bad-mouthing is like, and not in a colloquial sense, in this specific theoretical sense?
So if I were to use an example, let's say, for instance, we've got mother and child, for example, and mother doesn't want father involved, and mom can probably say something like, we can't feed your dog this month or your puppy this month because daddy didn't buy us dog food.
So
there's that sense of dad is, the child's hearing dad is not involved, but the child's hearing but dad is involved.
But inadequately.
Yes, and sure. And this indirect sort of shifting responsibility of projecting onto dad, that's, it's dad's fault that your puppy cannot eat because he didn't give us money for the food. So there's this indirect sort of, but this bad mouthing that takes place in subtle ways, but that are very, very emotionally manipulating.
Oh, for sure. Because I mean, if now suddenly you're a child, your puppy is your world, and you're told your puppy's not going to eat because dad went fishing instead of buying food.
Absolutely. And I'll give you another example. There's that another way it manifests is sort of the interference with visitation. And interference with visitation can be physical and symbolic as well. And I'll give you an example of the symbolic, which operates on an unconscious level, is that sense of, child has to go to dad this weekend. Let's just say mommy says, I don't like it when you go to dad because mommy misses you so much.
Okay, so you're going to feel that guilt that, I'm having a great time, but I know mom's having a terrible time right now.
So what happens is that the child becomes sort of having to become pleasing to both, and sort of, which sort of informs the child's unconscious decision to sort of side with the one parent and form the coalition with the other parent.
Okay.
So it becomes quite complex, actually.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we're looking at the physical level in which, child needs to go to dad this weekend, and there's things like, well, the child can't come because the child's tired, or because the child has to do this or has to do that. So sort of limiting and minimizing sort of the importance of visitation.
But also putting in obstacles in the way as well.
Absolutely.
So like you said, the child's tired or they're sick. And I think maybe with COVID, we've seen that come up more frequently, especially during our hard lockdown, where we saw laws which I don't think had thought out, child custody disputes, where it basically gave whoever the child was with, be it mum or dad, whether the primary custodian or not, if there was a concern, and it was a very vague term, they could deny access to the child by that parent.
I know you wrote an article during the COVID. Perhaps just maybe tell our viewers what the article was called and what it was about a bit.
So the article looked at an unintentional state of maintained parental alienation during the hard lockdown, which is kind of what I'm alluding to now, was that they hadn't been thought when these laws came in with the fact, or with the regulations came in, not laws, about denying access to the child. So there was aspects of, let's say, mom had the child and it's dad's visitation week, but now they said if there's any concern, you could stop them from going. So what that meant was that I didn't have to have a good reason. I just had to think there was a problem and I could deny you access, which is exactly what you're saying. And obviously it went through a lot of the psychological processes as well, but also just the fact that, in very rash decisions, the psychological aspects were neglected, which often happens. We've seen where physical health trumps mental health, where the idea, we saw that with, patients who were ill in hospital. You couldn't have family visitations, or even people who were dying. Family, parents, children, sisters, brothers, wives, husbands couldn't come and visit because the idea was to keep these people safe. Yet you had depression, you had all kinds of other loss going on.
So you can see how there's always this sense of, I don't want to use the word excuse, but there's sort of that excuse to sort of, at different times, where one can use certain social situations to obstruct and to create limitations on visitation and things like that. So I think your article is quite relevant in this context, especially.
Yeah. I think the article highlighted the fact that it hadn't been thought through, and like what you'd said, this kind of social occurrence gave free rein for obstruction to occur, which was challenged, and there were some shifts made as well. But I think it also has highlighted the fact that we don't think about these things because these kinds of family dynamics are often not thought about.
Which all this that we're speaking about has really grave implications for the child and for the targeted parent. It really just and I think when we're talking about the best interest of the child,
and that goes to the Children's Act, which trumps everything other than the Constitution.
Absolutely, and it really begs the question of what is the best interest of the child in a situation like this, with a child custody dispute where one is obstructing the other one from actually having contact with their child. It really just there's which is why I say I'd go broader and say it's a social issue. In that more people need to know about it, more people need to be psychoeducated about it. Barry, what was interesting as well is when I sort of interviewed my participants as well during this time, which this was about 2-3 years ago, sort of one of the questions that I had for them was, what social support systems are you guys using, social media, things like that? And what was quite shocking at the time is that there wasn't one support group for people going through parental alienation. So I think we've got a long way to go in terms of...
And maybe let's talk about some of the reasons for that. I think all literature is highlighting the fact that most clinicians are not trained in what parental alienation is, how to identify it, how to see it. I think the other reality is that it's generally only seen in custody disputes. So if you're going to therapy or you're taking your child to therapy because there's something going on or there's a family problem, a lot of the time it is missed.
It would be beneficial, I even stated in my research that I think for future research is to sort of look at maybe implementing these as workshops in the master's program of those students that wish to become clinical psychologists, to have some sort of training on it, and sort of, how do we go about sort of assessing this, perhaps developing a psychometric tool that assesses for parental alienation. And like we're saying, there's a syndrome where we're seeing cluster of symptoms, and perhaps an assessment tool that can perhaps assess, all three parties involved that sort of bring us to one conclusion, and it would be something objective that we could use in court as well.
Yeah, and I think also the fact is, before you talk about just an assessment tool, you want almost a, what's the word, a standard operating procedure, if you will. How do we do these assessments? Because again, different people are going to do it differently. There isn't a set formula to follow. What are the basic expectations? And I think I like the fact that you said that all three people need to be interviewed and need to be assessed. Because if I'm just assessing the alienator or the alienated, it gives me a very skewed perception. Right?
It does.
Also, the other reality is, like we were saying earlier, it's a hugely emotional time, right? And I think that can play out in terms of your clinician's experience or emotions as well. That you can easily side with the one parent who's maybe more manipulative or just has the story that you identify with. It's very easy then to see things that aren't there.
I think that's why I highlighted, and I think is very important, especially when we talk about parental alienation being used so loosely, is that there must be unfounded allegations.
Sure.
So in terms of sort of this unjustification for sort of stopping one parent from seeing the child.
Sure.
So I think that's key to look for as well when making these assessments, and sort of see, what are these? So sure, mom doesn't want the child to see dad, but based on what? There has to be founded allegations for that, so I think that's quite important.
And also you highlighted objective measures as well. And I think that's also very important, that we need some level of objectivity where it's not everything is just purely subjective.
Correct.
And I think maybe the idea is you need some kind of interplay between the two, because both have failings.
Sure.
But if you have an interplay between the two, keeping you on track and keeping, the objective measures still contextually appropriate, you could probably get the best of both worlds there.
And I think that'll sort of really hone, and look at what is the best interest of the child ultimately with all this.
And I think that's also important when we talk about the best interest of the child. The development of psychopathology or just giving the foundations to develop that is not in the best interest of the child, right? You also highlighted something else that I think is quite important, is that when you said about bad-mouthing or, holding views of the one parent against the alienated, it doesn't only stop there. It also goes to the rest of their family, if we think about it. That your extended family, your parents, your siblings, all become part of the problem.
Absolutely. I mean, a grandmother defines herself as a grandmother in relation to that of the child again, once again.
But also, if the child doesn't want to see you, they don't want to see your you don't want to see the grandmother either. You don't want to see anyone. And also, it's important, I think, also to highlight the fact that their views are direct mimics of the other parent's views.
Absolutely. You actually mentioned something that made me think about something now when we were talking about the manifestation earlier on, and there's the sense of this implicit message that say mom hates dad, but the child gets to a stage of awareness and starts realizing, but I'm made up of mom and dad. So thus I should hate part of myself, because if mom hates dad and I'm in collision with mom and I'm hating dad too, to sort of serve mom in some sort of way, that really, what does that mean for one's self-identity as the child, and sort of one sort of starts to alienate themselves. So in other words, we see it on with the father as well. The father starts to feel alienated, but he sort of becomes a perpetuating factor in the alienation, in the sense within himself, in that he feels, perhaps I am worthless, perhaps I am. So all these negative things start to emerge within the self. And it becomes this sense of confirmation bias in a way. I haven't done anything wrong, yet the courts are ruling against me. I'm not allowed to see my child. I must be worthless. And the child as well, I'm made up of dad and mom. If dad is no good, that means I'm no good.
Sure, I think especially if we start thinking about what stage of development they're in, and if we're thinking about early adolescence, where the whole aspect is or the whole goal is trying to develop some set of identity or some sense of identity, you can imagine how confusing and damaging that would be.
Sure.
If there's such an aspect of self-loathing, or just almost an attempt to reject a major part of who you are.
So I think we've covered most of it, and
we have covered quite a lot.
What sort of parental alienation is. But in terms of support systems, I'd just like to say that so I've recently started doing support groups at my practice for fathers, which is a zone of emotional development in the Edenveld and Vegan area. As I mentioned before, I'm a clinical psychologist, and with my colleague Barry here today, who's a clinical psychologist as well. So if you've tuned in, we raising awareness for parental alienation, a very important topic that I think needs a lot of attention.
Sure.
So if you enjoyed this podcast, feel free to jump on the wagon of creating awareness with us.
And I think also you're welcome to contact both of us if you have any questions or if you need help to be put in contact with support that is available.
And you can get our details at the end of the show. Thanks for coming in, Barry.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.